Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor. And today, it's a Stephen King video. It's been a while since I've had a Stephen King video. I'm reading every book by Stephen King in publication order, and the book I'm talking about today is this one. It's Danse Macabre by Stephen King. Stephen King's study of the horror genre, at least 30 years of it about. He focuses in this book from the 1950s basically to through the 1970s, because this book came out in 1981. The hardcover came out in 1981. There was a trade paperback that came out in 1982, and this right here is the first edition of the mass market paperback that came out in 83. And there is a newer version of this where there was some extra material that was put in that is not in this one. I got the Kindle version so I could read that. I'm not sure how much it added to the whole discussion, but there is some new material if you get a newer edition of this. So this is his study of the horror genre, at least 30 years of it, and a bit more than that. He does talk about the three biggies: Dracula, Frankenstein, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, as well as some other classic works he touches on. But mostly it's stuff from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So mid-20th century stuff in this book. Stuff that he was intimately acquainted with because Stephen King was a big horror fan. And he knows a lot about horror. You have to give it to this guy. He does know a lot about horror. He talks a lot about archetypes. He talks about the three biggies, which would be the vampire, the werewolf, and the thing without a name, which could be Frankenstein, or it could be the Thing from the Thing movies. He touches upon the ghost, though not as much as you would expect. He talks about the bad place, which would be some place that is haunted or otherwise just plain bad. A place like the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, for example. A lot of, he tries not to get too academic, but he does. He can't help himself, I think. Although it's written in a very chatty, conversational style, which is interesting, which is nice. It's very readable, this book. I mean, even if you've never heard of the television shows or the movies that he's talking about, it's still interesting because he sprinkles everything with a bunch of biographical asides and his own personal thoughts and experiences with horror. And all of that stuff is really interesting. Anytime he goes into anything biographical, that's really interesting because this guy can tell a story. And he talks a lot of, a lot of personal stuff about how he feels about horror. And I think all of this stuff is sincere as far as his feelings about horror. I think it's a little simplistic at times, like when he's trying to put everything into archetypes like the Thing without a name or the werewolf or the vampire. There are plenty of things and creatures in horror that just you can't pigeonhole in that way. I kind of understand the way he did it. This is a book for mass consumption. And he was trying to explain in this book why horror is important. He got a lot of questions when he was first writing about, why do you write this stuff? Why do you write about horror? You've got talent. You could write about other things. And he has since then. But he tries to explain in this book why horror is important. And I think he does a good job. He touches on how horror is universal and how it's more than just one kind of thing, horror is. He also talks about how the times in which the horror is created, whether it's a television show, a movie, or a book, has a great effect on what is being written about or filmed. And that, I think, he's really got something there. I think there's a lot of truth in that. So the first half of this book deals a lot with movies, a lot of schlocky films that you've probably never heard of, like I Was a Teenage Werewolf and stuff like that. A lot of movies I've seen, but I don't know how many people younger than me have seen. One thing I could say about this book, as you read it, you get a lot of ideas for things that you want to watch and things that you want to read. So it was interesting just for that. But he talks a lot about movies. Then he has a chapter about horror on television and how terrible it usually is. At least it was at this time when he wrote this. It was interesting reading this and having him write about television and the films and movies. This was written at a time when there were no videotapes. There was no way you can watch stuff except for when it just happened to be broadcast, or if you saw some film at a second run movie house or something. So it was interesting thinking about the times in which he wrote this. I don't think what he has to say about the films are out of date, but a lot of the films are pretty out of date, and a lot of the television shows. This is all old stuff, of course, that he's talking about. Horror on television especially has moved on considerably because television is a whole nother thing now. The best part of this book, for me, and probably for most of you, is the second half of this book when he talks about writing and writers. There's some great stuff in the back half of this book. He sent questions out to the writers who were still around about the various books that he was talking about. Like Peter Straub's Ghost Story and Richard Matheson's The Shrinking Man. And most of the writers wrote back, and so they talk about the creation of these novels that he's focusing on in the back half of this book. And that stuff is really interesting. Like, if you're a Richard Matheson fan, you want to get this book just for that. I've read the Richard Matheson part in this book a few times. This is the first time in a while that I've read the whole book. But just the sections in the back about specific writers and specific books, that's really interesting stuff. He talks a lot about Peter Straub's Ghost Story, and Peter Straub talks a lot about that in the book. There's also a big section on The Haunting of Hill House. Shirley Jackson wasn't around, but he talks a lot about The Haunting of Hill House, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about that book. And there's some other books that he talks about. He has some nice things to say about James Herbert, and that was nice to read, the author of The Fog and The Dark and some other things. The Rats. James Herbert, who is sometimes considered the Stephen King of England. I'm not sure that's a fair comparison, but he is a pretty influential writer in horror, and at the time, he was just considered trash, you know. And his stuff is kind of trashy, but good at the same time. He makes an interesting comparison between James Herbert and Robert E. Howard, which is not a comparison I would have made, but it is an interesting one. And I kind of see his point, actually, as far as the drive and the power and the way those books are written and those stories were written. There is a comparison to be made. It's just not one I would have thought of. Not everything in this book works, but a surprising amount works really well in this. It's especially impressive since, considering when he wrote this, he was probably stoned out of his mind a good deal of the time when he was writing it. So yeah, good job, Stephen King. If you're interested in the horror genre at all, particularly 20th century horror, this is probably essential. It's a really interesting book for that. And like I said, if you're interested in Stephen King also, he has a lot to say about himself, his experiences, his experience with horror, his feelings about horror. All of that stuff is really great. So definitely you'd want to read this just for that. So I've got little Stephen King here. Good job, little Stephen King. I really like this one a lot. Another good book. So we've been doing well. Or I've been doing well with my Read Every Book by Stephen King. All the books, except for one, were pretty good. So yeah, Danse Macabre, I highly recommend it. So the next book I will be talking about for Stephen King is going to be Cujo, which I'm reading right now actually, and that is going to be fun to talk about. Okay guys, I will see you next time. Sunday Penguin is not going to be around because on Sunday I've got two videos, and one of them is going to be a very special announcement. So you got to tune in on Sunday for that. Okay guys, I will catch you next time.